Where was I? Ah, yeah, okay. And in fact, the constraints really on who the Prime Minister has in their cabinet are so severe in reality, the political limits and constraints, that actually, in some cases, the Prime Minister may even be forced to sack their own loyal allies. For example, Damien Green, who was effectively Deputy Prime Minister, Theresa May was forced to sack him because he was embroiled in a scandal. She was forced to sack him in 2017. So she could have kept him. Legally, constitutionally, she had the power to keep him in, but politically it would have been so damaging to her to keep him in. She was effectively forced to give one of her own closest and most loyal allies the boot. So there are very real political limits on the extent to which the Prime Minister really can just have a cabinet composed of their own loyal allies. In Theresa May's case, in fact, she, even to illustrate this, and the last time she attempted a cabinet reshuffle, January 2018, several cabinet ministers actually refused to be moved to the posts she appointed them to. Justine Greening actually quit the cabinet rather than move to the new post she'd been appointed to in the Department of Work and Pensions. And again, this could pose problems for Theresa May in the future, because she's lost a prominent Remainer from her cabinet, who will now be on the backbenches where she'll be free to vote against Brexit legislation, lead other MPs who she has influence over in voting against Brexit legislation, and so on. So a lot of political commentators believe Justine Greening's exit from the cabinet could cause a major headache for Theresa May in the future. Jeremy Hunt actually refused to leave his role as Health Secretary. She wanted to move him to a different role, and he just said no. If you try to push me in that, and if you really push it, I'm going to quit, and I'll be on the backbenches as well, making trouble for you. So she had to back down. Very embarrassing for her, because she'd already announced he was going to be moved, and he just refused. So cabinet ministers can be very powerful. If the Prime Minister fears their influence, and she doesn't want them on the backbenches, she wants to keep them in the cabinet bound by collective responsibility, they have a certain power over her to even dictate perhaps their own roles within cabinet and so on. And of course, a Prime Minister must pay attention to the members of her cabinet and to their concerns and so on, because if she consistently overrules or marginalises them, they will ultimately pay a political price for that. There will be a cost to that. Cabinet ministers' resignations can be very damaging to a Prime Minister's authority, as it shows she's lost the confidence of leading members of her own government. This doesn't make her look good in the eyes of the public, and it can even trigger a leadership challenge. So this was demonstrated graphically when Geoffrey Howe resigned from Thatcher's cabinet. This was really important because he had been seen as one of her most closest and loyal allies in the cabinet. So his resignation really showed her authority had really flowed away. She'd really lost a lot of her authority. And his resignation actually ultimately triggered a leadership contest, which she ultimately didn't survive. So ultimately it was her own cabinet colleague who brought about her downfall. This really demonstrates how powerful actually cabinet ministers can be, and demonstrates the limits on how freely Prime Ministers can ignore them, abuse them, sack them, move them around and so on. If they consistently do those kinds of things, it can lead to their downfall. And the important thing to consider about Thatcher, she was considered one of the most powerful Prime Ministers of the 20th century, yet even she ultimately was brought down by her own cabinet. Very important. So much for cabinet. So I hope I've shown there that cabinet can be significantly powerful and can resist the so-called elective dictatorship of a Prime Minister. Cabinet can be a very powerful institution. Let's look at Parliament. How much of an effective constraint is Parliament on a Prime Minister's powers? Well, to begin with, of course, one of the key principles of the UK Constitution is this principle of parliamentary sovereignty. And what this means in essence is that a government has to get Parliament's approval for all of its legislation. The government cannot pass a law, the Prime Minister cannot pass a law until it's gone through Parliament, until a majority at least in the House of Commons, has approved it. So any single piece of legislation proposed by a Prime Minister can, in theory, be rejected by Parliament. So this is potentially a very real and serious constraint on a Prime Minister's power. However, let's look at Lord Hailsham's argument in a bit more detail. He argued the UK has become an elective dictatorship. He argued that actually it's precisely parliamentary sovereignty that in reality gives the Prime Minister near dictatorial power. And let's break this down a little bit to see really what was he getting at. Well, he argued, there's several steps to his argument, so bear with me. First of all, he said, well, the governing party tends to have what he calls an inbuilt majority, or an automatic majority in the House of Commons, as a result of the first past the post voting system. You have seen through your studies of electoral systems that our voting system means that even on a minority of public votes, overall, most governing parties end up with a majority of seats in the House of Commons. Of the 20 elections held since the end of World War II, 17 of them, in other words, the vast majority of them, have ended up with a majority government. That is, a government that has a majority of the seats in the House of Commons. So he says this is the first point. Governments usually have an inbuilt majority in the House of Commons. Therefore, he argues, so long as the Prime Minister's own party, the governing party, vote for the Prime Minister's legislative proposals, she can get Commons approval for anything she wants, basically. Okay, as long as her own party votes for it, because she has a majority, it will get passed. So that's the House of Commons. But of course we know the House of Lords ultimately doesn't have the power to block legislation passed by the House of Commons. At most, they only, if it really comes down to this, at most, if they're really opposed to what the Commons are doing, the only legal constitutional power they have ultimately is to delay it by a year. So the House of Commons can overrule the House of Lords ultimately. And what that means is the governing party can overrule the House of Lords if the governing party have a majority in the House of Commons. By the way, bit I should have mentioned, of course, is that the whips on the one hand and the patronage system tend to ensure that the Prime Minister's party will vote for the Prime Minister's proposals in Parliament. The whips, because they have whatever powers they bring to bear, there are different systems of manipulating and encouraging backbenchers to vote how the government wants them to. The patronage system, worth mentioning again here, because backbench MPs of the governing party know that ultimately if they want their career to progress, if they want a government position and ultimately a cabinet position, it's in their interests not to rock the boat too much, not to vote against the Prime Minister's proposals too much, because ultimately the Prime Minister controls their career. It's her who has the power to bring them into government, bring them into cabinet. So her patronage powers and the whips usually mean she will get her own party's MPs to vote for her proposals in the House of Commons. The House of Lords doesn't have the power to block it. And of course, the absence of a codified constitution means that there are no legal limits or constitutional limits on what laws can be passed. So literally a Prime Minister, as long as their own MP, as long as they have a majority and their own MPs support what they do, can literally do anything they want. Yeah, the House of Lords can't stop them. There's no constitution can stop them. Yep. So this is what Hailsham meant by the UK being an elective dictatorship. And it does suggest, indeed, that the Prime Minister's powers are limitless. However, really, this overlooks a number of quite important considerations. Firstly, of course, there's a few assumptions in Lord Hailsham's argument that need unpicking. So firstly, of course, well, governing parties do not always have a majority of seats in the House of Commons. That's the first point to make. In fact, of the last 3 elections, 2 of them have led to governments which did not, governing parties which did not have a majority. The 2010 election led to a hung parliament, and so did the 2017 election. So, and without a majority in the House of Commons, of course, a Prime Minister is especially vulnerable to losing parliamentary votes. So, for example, we've seen already with Theresa May, since last year's election in 2017, she's already been defeated on the key issue of the day, Brexit, by her own MPs, or a backbench revolt of her own MPs, who defeated the government during the EU withdrawal bill, defeated the government's attempts to give ministers the right to amend EU legislation before it goes into UK law, and defeated the attempt to the government's proposal that a final deal should be conducted without consulting Parliament. So this was quite a major defeat on a major issue for Theresa May's government. So this shows there's no elective dictatorship here. Especially a minority government is going to be vulnerable to losing votes. But even with a majority, the governing party cannot always rely on its legislation getting passed, because it cannot always guarantee its own MPs are going to support whatever it wants to do. So, for example, Tony Blair, again, won 3 elections in a row, considered a very powerful, popular prime minister, but he was defeated by his own MPs 4 times in his last year in office. And ultimately, these defeats basically led to him being forced to resign, because you can't really govern as prime minister if you can't get your own proposals through Parliament. So even with the majority, the point is here, even with a majority in the House of Commons, a prime minister cannot guarantee that their proposals will always be supported, even by their own party's MPs. Let's consider the House of Lords as well. Hailsham argues, well, the House of Lords can be overruled by the House of Commons. Well, that's technically, legally, constitutionally true. But the reality is, a defeat in the House of Lords is often so embarrassing to the government that it will lead to the government withdrawing or at least amending their legislation. So, for example, George Osborne in 2015 pushed it through the House of Commons, won the vote in the House of Commons, a proposal to cut tax credits significantly, a significant cut to the benefit paid to low-income working people. But it was defeated in the House of Lords, and after the defeat in the House of Lords, Osborne was so embarrassed by that he actually withdrew the proposal. Yeah, so defeats in the House of Lords can lead to reversals of government policy, and do lead to reversals of government policy. So it's perhaps true to say that the image that we sometimes have, that Hailsham's portrayal suggests, of a basically powerless, toothless House of Lords, is not entirely correct.